conflict over oil and gas wealth in the Mediterranean has turned into a burning substance, which increases the causes of conflicts and disputes over interests. From the long-standing water and oil conflict between Lebanon and Israel to the newly exploded conflict between Turkey on one side, and Greece, and the Republic of Cyprus on the other side, as Turkey, on its way to political expansion to reach the Libyan shores, ignored that the shores of Crete are Greek lands, all the way to the third, recent conflict, between Turkey and Egypt, the two major countries in the eastern Mediterranean region, due to the increase in population in each of them on the one hand, and their industrial progress on the other hand, which requires a high consumption of energy to feed these industries. Turkey is an important transit point for Russian and Caspian oil and gas to Europe. However, it lacks petroleum reserves and needs to increase its annual petroleum imports, given the enormity and development of its industries. That is why Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan seized the opportunity to explore for oil in the eastern Mediterranean to participate in the region's wealth. Thus, the entry of the Turkish side on the front line in the region from the Libyan gate is a direct reason for fueling the conflict, and entering a new phase at the political and military level together, which prompted the countries of the region to establish the Mediterranean Gas Forum, based in Cairo, which includes Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, Jordan, and Palestine and Israel, while Turkey was excluded from it for political and strategic calculations. Here is a presentation of the aspects of the struggle for wealth between the countries bordering the Mediterranean, in which the economist Walid Kaddouri and Dr. Tariq Fahmy, a specialist in international relations, participated. Economic and geopolitical factors participated in the discovery of petroleum, oil and gas, in most of the producing countries. The geopolitical conflict increased in some cases to include intense competitions between international companies. Conflicts intensified at times to obtain favorable conditions to develop and include a conflict between the competing companies' countries, major industrial countries. These conflict facets extended throughout the 20th century, and recently emerged in the young gas industry in the eastern Mediterranean. The discovery of gas in Egyptian waters north of the ports of Alexandria and Port Said encouraged the countries and regions bordering the eastern Mediterranean, Palestine, Israel, Cyprus, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey, that complain about the scarcity of sources of petroleum wealth in their lands, to try to benefit from the Egyptian discoveries to start seismic surveys in its exclusive economic zones in the Mediterranean, to learn about the geology of its marine areas, and the possibility of discovering petroleum fields there. The Arab-Israeli conflict constituted the first geopolitical dispute in the eastern Mediterranean gas, when in 1999 the Palestinian Authority awarded a contract for exploration and production in the Gaza Sea to British Gas and its partners, the Union of Contractors company located in Athens, which has Palestinian ownership, and the Palestinian Investment Fund of the Palestinian National Authority. British Gas discovered the Gaza Marine Field in 2000, with gas reserves limited to 1.4 trillion cubic feet. Despite the passage of 2 decades, this Palestinian marine field is still undeveloped, due to Israel's continuous refusal to develop it. The Royal Dutch Shell Company recently bought the assets of the British Gas Company, including the Gaza Marine Field. However, Shell decided not to develop and produce the field, and took the initiative to offer its share in Gaza Marine for sale. The two Arab partners, the Consolidated Contractors Company and the Palestinian Investment Fund, are working to find an oil company to work with them in the field, and to find appropriate ways to exploit its gas wealth. Israel has a monopoly on supplying the West Bank with fuel, at prices, and in the quantities it determines. Israel has also dominated the Gaza fuel supply, with a small window for Egypt to contribute as well. Stopping the development of the field and cutting off supplies to the West Bank and Gaza at a time when Israel envisages it was the first oil conflict in the eastern Mediterranean. Not to demarcate marine borders before taking an interest in petroleum discoveries. As for the second conflict, it includes the problem of not drawing the maritime boundaries of the exclusive economic zones between neighboring countries before paying attention to the petroleum wealth, due to the possibility of these areas overlapping close together. In addition to the Arab-Israeli conflict, Lebanon and Cyprus reached in 2007 to draw the middle line between the two countries. But the southern or northern point of this line has not been determined. The determination of the southern point required a tripartite meeting between Cyprus, Lebanon, and Israel. However, since Lebanon is at war with Israel, such a meeting cannot be held. As for the northern point, Syria refuses to negotiate to draw the maritime border with Lebanon, and then determine the northern point between Lebanon, Syria, and Cyprus. Lebanon was forced to draw these 2 points, just a few points away from the imposed points, in order to move forward in drawing the middle line with Cyprus. He deposited a diplomatic note and maps of his maritime borders with the Secretary-General of the United Nations, regardless of the northern and southern points. For its part, the Maritime Border Agreement between Cyprus and Lebanon confirmed that neither of the parties had agreed with the third party without returning to the second party to obtain his prior approval. This solution was the only option available to Lebanon in drawing the middle line with Cyprus. However, Nicosia later took the initiative to agree with Israel bilaterally, and to announce the demarcation of its exclusive economic zone borders with Israel without informing the Lebanese side, which led to Israel laying its hands on important oil-promised areas in the far southern Lebanese waters. The United States tried to play the mediating role to resolve the dispute, but to no avail. The American negotiator demanded political conditions that Lebanon should present, which led to the faltering of negotiations and the failure to reach positive results for Lebanon's rejection of the American demands. It is expected that the problem of Israel's seizure of an important part of the southern Lebanese waters will pose challenges to companies operating in southern Lebanon in the near future, despite the ability of these companies to explore for gas several kilometers north of the disputed areas. The Turkish-Egyptian conflict and Ankara's attempts to expand. The third conflict, which is recent, concerns the two largest countries in the eastern Mediterranean region, Turkey and Egypt, due to the high population in each of them on the one hand, and their industrial progress, which requires high energy consumption to feed these industries. Turkey is a very important transit point for Russian oil and gas and the Caspian Sea countries to Europe. However, Turkey lacks oil reserves, and it needs to increase its annual oil imports due to the large and developed industries. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has adopted a policy with two goals: expansion in neighboring regions, and support for Islamist movements. He seized the opportunity of oil exploration in the eastern Mediterranean to share in the region's wealth. Erdogan also supports the policies of the Muslim Brotherhood, but despite this, hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day from the oil of the Kurdistan region of Iraq to Israel are allowed to be exported through the Turkish port of Ceyhan to the Israeli port of Ashkelon. At the same time, it requires that Egypt make continuous efforts to find new oil reserves to meet the increase in annual oil consumption, while its oil reserves are still relatively limited, as well as the annual work to increase gas reserves, which, although they have increased recently, especially after the discovery by ENI of the giant Zar field in 2015, which is considered the largest gas field in the Mediterranean, the increase in domestic consumption, and the adoption of about 85% of electric power generation. The Egyptian government is currently on gas, in addition to Egypt's attempt to make the most of its gas facilities from international gas pipelines and gas liquefaction stations for export, pushing it to increase discoveries to find new fields annually, including the current attempts to explore and produce from the western regions of the Mediterranean close to the Libyan waters. It will be negatively affected by the Turkish-Libyan border agreement. Egypt is considered an oil and gas country at the same time, which makes it in a better position than Turkey, which lacks oil reserves, but Egypt's problem is that it suffers from a deficit in oil production compared to its domestic consumption. As for natural gas, most electrical stations have been supplied with gas, which means a high and increasing annual internal consumption of gas, which calls for the need to discover new gas fields to compensate for what is consumed, and to meet the increase in annual consumption. Turkey and Cyprus. Ankara has taken advantage of the gas discoveries in the eastern Mediterranean to try to extend its influence. The first step was pressure and threats to the Cyprus exploration attempts. Ankara claimed that the Cyprus exclusive economic zone belongs to Turkish waters. Its warplanes were sent to fly at a low level over the rigs operating in Cypriot waters, but Cyprus, a member of the European Union, continued its exploration, despite Turkish threats. Nicosia, along with international oil companies, also rejected a second Turkish threat, which is to boycott any company operating with permission from the Cypriot authorities. Ankara did indeed threaten the ENI company to stop its business in Turkey, but the European Union rejected this threat, and with it the ENI company. Then Turkey defied the maritime border agreements between Egypt and the Republic of Cyprus, which required the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to issue a strongly worded memorandum threatening strong reactions, in the event Turkey interferes with the Egyptian Cypriot border agreement. In mid-January 2019, Egypt initiated a meeting in Cairo for the energy ministers of the producing, consuming and transit countries in the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and Italy, to establish the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. The United States supported the establishment of the forum, which it is noticeable that Turkey and Russia are not invited to participate in it. The forum welcomed two projects under implementation. The first is the joint export of Egyptian, Cypriot and Israeli liquefied gas from Egyptian gas liquefaction plants. This joint export works in the interest of the three countries, as the quantities of gas discovered in Cyprus and Israel are still limited, and are not considered economic enough for export. However, by joint exporting LNG, supplies can be met for a large market, such as the European market. At the same time, the forum welcomed the construction of an offshore gas pipeline that starts from Haifa, Cyprus, Greece, and even Italy in the future. Through this project, Israeli gas will be merged with Cyprus and exported in a separate project to the European market. The European market supported studies of the project, which cost about $7 billion. The heads of state concerned recently signed the project agreement. Except that there is a big loophole. So far, no sale and purchase contract has been signed with any European company to buy gas. This raises surprising, as a contract for the sale and purchase of gas is usually obtained by the consuming company before the construction of liquefaction plants or export pipelines, which usually cost billions of dollars. It is clear that the forum laid a roadmap for exports of Eastern Mediterranean gas excluding Turkey, as well as the central role of Egypt for the Eastern Mediterranean gas industry. What provided Egypt with this pioneering role was the huge gas discoveries in its waters. Turkey responded to these projects by increasing its pressure on the legitimacy of neighboring countries to explore for gas in their waters, and then announced the drawing of new, unprecedented maritime borders between them and Libya. It denounced Greece, which passes this border near its waters adjacent to the Greek island of Crete, and ends in the west of Libya, not far from the Egyptian border, as Egypt is currently working on discovering petroleum in the neighboring waters. Egypt has condemned the announcement of the new maritime borders between Turkey and Libya, despite the fact that the two countries are not contiguous. The joint declaration sparked widespread controversy in Libya itself due to differences between Tripoli and Benghazi over the authority of the Prime Minister to sign an international agreement without the participation of all cabinet members to sign as well. The Speaker of Parliament denounced and opposed the agreement that provides for the possibility of Turkey sending military advisors to Libya, given the seriousness of the volatile security situation in the country. It is not unlikely that there will be clashes between the Egyptian and Turkish forces in the future. Egypt declared that the Turkish military presence in Libya constituted a threat to its national security. Israel's plans to export oil and gas. Since the beginning of its gas discoveries in the first decade of the second millennium, Israel has focused its attention on exploiting gas internally, and then moving towards exports. It was agreed to preserve 60% of the gas reserves for the domestic market and 40% for export. And Israel began to rely on gas to feed power plants. As for exports, Israel's primary interest was exporting to the large and relatively close European market, compared to the Asian market. In the first years, attention was turned off by the discoveries in the Tamar and Leviathan fields for export to Europe. Given the high costs of developing the two fields, about $20 billion, Israel has turned its attention to exporting to neighboring Arab countries that have concluded peace treaties with them. The matter also won the interest of the producing companies due to the shortening of the pipelines, thus reducing the construction costs. Therefore, Israel, with the support of the United States, has tended to adopt export projects to Jordan and Egypt, and there are negotiations to export gas from the Gaza Marine Field to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but these negotiations are still in their initial stages. The conflict over oil and gas wealth in the Mediterranean has turned into a burning substance, which increases the causes of conflicts and disputes over interests. From the long-standing water and oil conflict between Lebanon and Israel to the newly exploded conflict between Turkey on one side, and Greece, and the Republic of Cyprus on the other side, as Turkey, on its way to political expansion to reach the Libyan shores, ignored that the shores of Crete are Greek lands, all the way to the third, Recent conflict between Turkey and Egypt, the two major countries in the eastern Mediterranean region, due to the increase in population in each of them on the one hand, and their industrial